Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's digital conversation focusing on mental health. COVID-19 has disrupted or halted our critical mental health services. According to the recent World Health Organization survey, 93% of countries worldwide have halted mental health care, while the demand for mental health is increasing. Bereavement, isolation of income, and fear are triggering mental health conditions or exacerbating existing ones. How do we deal with this when adequate assistance is not provided? How do we ensure that mental health is a priority in the healthcare system? Tonight, we get to unpack this with our esteemed panel, well versed on the topic, whom I'm excited to share the next hour with. My name is Makosazana Bambisa, and I'd like to welcome our panelists. We've got Dr. D, very famous in this space. We've got Mr. Mgomez Zulu, and we've got Miss Lizzie. I'm just gonna take 5 minutes just to talk about our YLC program before just introducing our panel. And our panel really doesn't need any introduction at all. So the YLC program. Sorry. Okay. I think Mr. H is actually, Mrs. H is actually online. Just to give like a 5 minutes overview on the YLC program before we actually introduce our panelists tonight. Mrs. H, I'd like you to switch on your camera and just talk about YLC just for 2 seconds for our panelists as well as our attendees.
Oh, sure. Yes. So actually, the Young Leaders Connect program is a program that we actually launched. It's now just a year and maybe a month old. And what we basically did was, from the International Women's Forum of South Africa, which is our global sort of mothership, where Dr. D and I are actually members, we consist of close to 100 members of women, ranging from government to academia, business, citizens, businesswomen, etc. And we actually, our patron is Dr. Zanele Mbeki, who actually brought this chapter to South Africa because International Women's Forum is a global chapter. And this institution actually birthed the Young Leaders Connect. And the whole idea behind YLC is to actually hand the baton over to the next generation of leaders. So we have a combination of young leaders who we call mentees, who basically we're developing, and we actually pair up with the International Women's Forum of South Africa, who have these very esteemed and powerful members who are actually paying it forward to the YLC Connect members. And we also have another pillar called entrepreneurship, where we have a lot of our young women who are entrepreneurs in various sectors across the country, and we actually pair them up to see how we best help grow and develop their business, as well as create market access. And we also work with a number of associations ranging from the IDC, etc., to actually provide funding and capital for these businesses. And we also have a more formal program with the Graduate Institute, Stellenbosch Graduate Institute, where we actually put these entrepreneurs through a formal training program. And I think most importantly, also what we've also done is we are now starting to figure out how we actually also put these mentees and the board and the entrepreneurs through a board leadership development program. So we're working with Bain and McKinsey, the IOD, and a number of institutions, so that no longer can we have that excuse of there's no women available for a lot of these board directorships and board positions. And we're in the process now of actually closing out the formal and informal part for cohort 1, and we're in the process of actually introducing a second cohort for these young leaders. And once they are interviewed and they are accepted, we'll actually start a similar process with, of course, lessons learned from how we launched the first cohort for the second cohort of the Young Leaders Connect. And as many of these women who have taken up that banner and already started paying it forward and doing phenomenal things in the different sectors, who are joining us here tonight, who will also, I think, interact with the panel, share some of their own examples. And we also, myself included, we're all here to actually learn because of this shock of what we've gone over for the past year and a half. So we're looking forward to the conversation. Thank you, Kosi, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. H. And I'd just like to extend that I am part of cohort 1 on the mentorship program for YLC. And if you have not applied to join the cohort too, I just encourage you to do so. I think it has been very phenomenal and very beneficial, just to encourage the others that are joining today's conversations that I actually have not applied. Okay. So I will actually also encourage our panel to actually pose questions. There is a space for chats. Please do also add your questions. This is quite an interactive session, so it would be nice to hear your views as well. So I'd like to actually introduce our panel tonight. I don't think there's a lot of people in this world that will talk about the fact that they've had an encounter with Nelson Mandela. But Dr. Doreen Kara Whale, better known as Dr. D, or so affectionately known as Dr. D, has had actually that engagement. And, you know, Nelson Mandela actually said to her, I don't know if you're aware of the hope and inspiration you offer and the difference you make to so many lives. Dory, thank you for the great contribution you make to building our nation. And I think a lot of us can attest to that with the many entertainment or media interactions that we've had with Dr. D. So Dr. D is a clinical and organizational psychologist with over 30 years of experience in hospital, private and corporate practice. She's an internationally recognized and respected international speaker, an expert in personal development and human relation, and has addressed over 100,000 people and facilitated workshops in 57 countries. Dr. D also serves as a mediator, a facilitator, and an executive coach. She is a household name in South Africa who regularly appears on TV and radio and is quoted in the press and media frequently. She was the media psychologist for the Oscar Pistorius trial. Currently, she hosts the weekly podcast Thrive with Dr. D and her live show Coffee and Connect with Dr. D. During this time of the coronavirus pandemic, she is the sought-after international panelist and a global speaker on mental health and on post-traumatic growth. She's got recognitions. I mean, her list of recognitions is actually endless, but I'll just quote three, where she was, recognized as being the SA's most influential woman in government and business, a lifetime achiever by the CEO magazine, ABSA Jewish Achiever, Cyril Harris Humanitarian Award, a Rotary Paul Harris Award, and a Professional Speakers Association Educator Hall of Fame. I'd like to welcome Dr. D to our panel. We also have Mr. Mvimvi William Gomezulu, who's also a clinical psychologist. He completed his MA degree in clinical psychology from the University of Pretoria. He's currently in private practice and is one of the psychologists working at Life Glenview Hospital in Benoni. He has been at counseling service for 23 years and has 20 years of experience as practicing clinical psychologist. His area of focus includes working with diverse range of patients and clients involving children, adolescents, adults, and family with special interest in trauma counseling, marital and couples therapy, diversity management, team building interventions, and conflict management. We also have Miss Lizzie Mbata Makua, who is also another clinical psychologist who's currently working at a military hospital in Pretoria. I think that's quite interesting and we'd like to unpack that. Her work involves supervising and training interns, among other responsibilities. She's also currently working as an external marker for honors module in psychology at the University of South Africa. Her fields of interest are psychiatry, including addiction, working with families, couples, spirituality, and teenagers. I'd like to welcome our panelists. And I'd like to have as an opening question to actually Dr. D. When I was researching on mental health, I found that there's a definition there by the World Health Organization saying mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. I'd like to hear from your view, how do you define mental health and or mental illness? I think you are on mute, Dr. D. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, right.
I
Can
can
you hear
hear
me
you
now?
now. Yes, I can hear you
Okay,
now. Thank
good,
you.
good. Well, thank you for that excellent question. And also, I love the idea that it's called YLC, Young Leaders Connect, because actually, one of the things that we're talking about so much when it comes to the global mental health pandemic, just before I answer your question, is just the loss of connection and therefore the importance of connection that we have to focus on, in the workplace and amongst each other. Human beings are wired for connection. So just listening to the introduction of all of us, one of the things that I've already enjoyed so much is just meeting two new colleagues and knowing in my mind that I want to retain the connection with my two colleagues sitting here with me that I've just been introduced to and get to know them and their fascinating work better. So the connect part is important. In terms of your definition, I think that it is a comprehensive definition. I wouldn't try and change the definition that you've just read to us from the World Health Organization about mental health. It's basically some kind of knowledge and expectation that things don't run smoothly all the time, but that are at a level, and our coping skills are at a level that we usually can deal in a relatively productive way with some ups and downs, with what gets thrown to us and what we have to deal with life. When mental health becomes compromised, which we will talk about of why it has become so compromised, is we see signs of personal behavior and a kind of flood of emotion that is overwhelming. And essentially, that's manifest as an inability to deal with what we have to deal with, whether it's our job in the workplace, whether it's our relationships, whether it's some kind of sense of stability with our moods, that it's not the same as just having a bad day that might last for a day or two. It's impaired functioning. It's when our functioning becomes impaired. And to me, the most important thing that I have seen about the pandemic is, well, first of all, mental health has been destigmatized in a way, which I think I would like to hear what my colleagues think about it. But I think, in a sense, that's been quite a good thing because now everyone's talking about it. Even when you say, hello, how are you? Today, it has a different meaning to kind of, hello, how's it? Which was used to be, when we say, how are you? People kind of know that you're saying, how have you been through this really tough time? And people are being more open, a little bit more open about how they have been. So the fact that everyone is kind of has been affected makes it a little bit easier to talk about the fact that I'm having a hard time or that I've gone through a period of huge uncertainty, which is affecting me in my functioning. So it's opened up the capacity to speak about it, just like we're doing now. That in itself doesn't mean, because there are normal reactions to a very traumatic situation, doesn't mean we don't feel the feelings or we need to address some of the symptoms and the functioning. We do. But it's become a little bit less stigmatized and essential to use each other to talk about what we're going through with regard to mental health than it was before.
Thank you so much. And I think that that is the one thing that we're actually currently experiencing in workplaces, that, the change of use of how are you? I think before it was just a passing statement. I think with a lot of people actually experiencing, loss, experiencing so many changes in environment, there has been a change in how we engage and how we connect with people. And so thank you so much for that. And I think it just leads to the next question that I'd like to ask Mr. Mgomezulu, actually saying, we currently experiencing a lot of isolation. I mean, this has been extended in so many different spaces. I think if you just think back to 2020 in March, when they made an announcement that a lot of us are actually just going to work from home, and there has been a limited movement. People that were actually living alone are now moved from engaging with other people to actually getting to a space where you just home alone with very little interaction with other humans except through electronic devices. There were people that, I mean, loss of income as a result of the pandemic. How do we deal with this when there is, um, when there is such a limited interaction, like as and I'm trying to best explain this because the World Health Organization actually says that 93% of countries um, have actually um, have actually halted mental health, and now we're actually faced with an excessive, exacerbated need for mental health, because of the many things that have happened during the conversation. So just weighing in on that, how do we deal with this, and when is the adequate assistance, when adequate assistance is actually not provided?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think it is quite sad when you look at the state of mental health services, because when you look at it, even before you look at issues of isolation, and what their impact on human beings and people suffering from mental health issues. The impact is so great that I also feel that if you look at what is happening currently, we have not yet even we are not even feeling the effects of what COVID has done. I think the greatest of effect that we're going to feel would possibly be after a year or so, where a lot of people who are suffering from the isolation factor will be coming forth. Remember, when we talk about the issues of isolation, during the lockdown, for example, there were a number of things that were happening that people were not prepared for. And one of those things is that people were so used to not living together, whether in smaller spaces as a family, because everyone was busy with going to work or attending school. But all of a sudden now you have to stay at home. And part of those discussions simply means that you now have to attend to the issues that normally you run away from. And that in a way created a major impact, in terms of families and the conflict that happened. And sometimes you're looking at issues that have to do with the isolation and suicide, where a lot of people could not even deal with being alone and dealing with themselves in most cases. But coming to the issue, though, of how do we navigate, this impact of COVID, I think in most cases, what we are not talking about is how does it feel, working from home, for example, where there is another form of isolation, and how do you deal with being alone and with less interaction, and what that it means for people who might be having mental health issues. That simply means that it's difficult, and at the same time, you need to have methods or routines that are healthy in dealing with those issues of isolation. Firstly, there are things that we often are not talking about. Issues of economics. Like if you are setting an office at home, for example, what are the issues that we need to look at? Issues like how you sit, how your body gets to be affected, and in a way, how do you deal with the exhaustion, and what are the other things that you can do, to make sure that you take care of your mental health and by merely doing that, you take care of your body. A lot of people, for example, tended to use alcohol, for example, to cope, which is it's something that needed to be attended to in terms of talking to it, that people should not be using, these substances to cope. And it's very important also to look at always being aware, of our mental status. Being aware of our mental status simply means that we are able to monitor ourselves. We are also able to monitor others, and we also allow others to monitor us, because the feedback that we get from other people is very critical in terms of assisting us in terms of our coping mechanisms. A lot has been said about how we check our diets, for example. Are we eating healthy? Is the food that we are taking, is it nutritious? And dealing with issues of isolation, for example, simply means that time that you spend, how do you use it? Do you use exercises, for example? Do you use relaxation? Do you check on other people? Because that part of interaction is also important. Do you allow yourself to be monitored? Because sometimes you find that people do not talk about what they are experiencing. And also developing a healthy routine of rituals to keep our sanity, and also ensuring that we avoid, what is considered to be habits that are not healthy.
Thank you so much for that. And I think you touched on a lot of things. I actually gave birth during the hard lockdown. So I had no visitors. I actually had to sit in hospital and look after my little one with I think my husband only being allowed to see the baby for like an hour. So I understand the issues that come with isolation, because they were brand new mothers that were there and had very little assistance or guidance, from the external world, because we are locked into the space where we are actually isolated. And I think you also touched on another point, which is de-isolation. And this is going to move into my question with Miss Lizzie, actually, because we wear so many hats, right? And I think when we moved into a space where we were working from home, we were now forced to be teachers to our kids. We were and Mr. Mgomezulu touched on it. There were issues that we could run away from that we couldn't, because now we are home the whole time. And I think the study that was shown by the World Health actually shows that the pandemic has actually affected younger people rather than older people. And I suppose because a lot of us used to escape to work or escape to another place, but now I've got young families, we've got young kids. So what are the most vulnerable and increased psychological distresses that we're actually facing as young people?
I think she's on
On
mute,
mute,
Lizzie.
Sis Liz. You are actually on mute, Sis Lizzie. Can you please unmute yourself?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. So talking about stressors, especially regarding young people. Firstly, if you think about the youth, the age group, a lot of them are at, different stages of their lives. So if you think about, for example, the youth that we refer to that are still at school, Mr. Mgomezulu touched on the fact that, routine is one of the things that are very important. For example, that to ensure that there's something that you do every day and you are set in it to, release those stressful events. But now with children having to stop going to school, for example, now that comes to a halt. And remember, we're also very social beings as human beings. So now you have to stick to a new routine, which you probably have to now adjust to once again at home. and not being able to see your friends, not being able to escape that environment that you're living in. And I mean, let's face it, South Africa has quite a big divide in terms of, the rich and the poor. So unfortunately, if you think about someone who has to study at home, chances are not everybody is able to do that in an environment that is conducive. So that becomes more stressful because now you have to adjust to not only staying at home and having to deal with whatever you cannot escape. For some people, it could be issues of even, privacy, issues of space, and having to adjust to just those two factors, for example, but then you cannot escape, you know? And, for the older youth, those entering the work market, now when COVID started, everybody went on hard lockdown. What that then meant is that jobs became more scarce and some people even lost their jobs. So that if imagine if you were the only breadwinner, as a young person, who everybody was, dependent on you, suddenly that also changes. Now you can imagine how that will impact on someone's mental health because now you are the breadwinner, there was a bit of progress in life, but then suddenly you have to deal with that setback. You don't even know whether it's a temporary setback or if it's a long-term setback. And obviously that could also push someone into, a depressive state because everybody depended on you and then suddenly the circumstances change and those feelings of worthlessness and helplessness then and suicidality possibly, increase. So I think with our youth, there are many, many issues involving our youth. And then there are also issues of health, and being able to get access to facilities. Some who go to varsities, for example, were able to access mental health services, at school, and that became a bit bearable for them to be able to cope with certain things. Now you go back home and find that it becomes quite difficult for you to even travel because of financial constraints, because of new responsibilities that are now solely your responsibility as the young person in the house. Perhaps parents now become ill, and the younger people in the family need to start taking the lead in that family. Also, I think in terms of family structure, our family structure in South Africa has been quite, different. It's not your typical nuclear family of mom, dad, children. We've got extended families that we need to deal with. And even with that, with the debts and the financial implications thereof, that could push someone also again into a state of anxiety, a state of depression, in terms of thinking of how do I now try to readjust to life in this fashion. I mean, with the pandemic, a lot of people lost a lot of family members in a short space of time. So even thinking about, in the Black communities, how funerals were conducted. You got a chance to say goodbye to your family members in an appropriate way, in ways that allowed for one to get closure. Now, as a child, suddenly being told that you cannot see your mother, or you cannot see your father, or you cannot see your uncle, or whatever parental figure, that you identified with and that you loved. Now, this suddenly becomes a new way of doing things. Funeral rites are no longer being allowed. So even such that, you don't get the necessary time to process the losses, and yet you're expected to just get up and go. And now suddenly you find yourself overnight, you now became the adult of the house and you didn't have enough time to process all of those changes. And the younger ones are now looking up at you and the pressure builds because now there's no escape for you as the adult, even though you are still part of the youth. Now having to think about, how do I even transition into this position. But then again, with all those other challenges, chances are with young adults going through so many other changes, the issue of their mental health was possibly already under, you know, quite a heavy burden, and they possibly didn't even know that they're sitting with a mental health issue. And then when the losses happen, that sort of then just, you know, becomes even more of a challenge, and it just escalates from there. And you'd find that that's when someone actually finds out that I actually had a mental disorder or a mental illness or a, you know, challenge that I'd been sitting with for all this time. But because of how, you know, I couldn't get a break to sit and actually process things. I was probably on the go, go, go. Now you go home. Now you have the time to sit and think and feel and deal. And then that suddenly becomes overwhelming and you don't know how to deal with it. And you don't know where to go because you've never really, as a youth, sought help because you always had friends, you always had other things that kept you busy. So I think this reality then starts to set in, and obviously, people are not necessarily capacitated or equipped to deal with such intense losses and such intense situations in a short space of time because it's never been something that they go to per se. So I think this is why our youth is more vulnerable because there are a lot of things on both spectrums of being a young one, but then overnight anything can happen, changes take place, and then suddenly you find yourself on the other side of the spectrum where you are now suddenly the adult, you know, within the family. So yes, that is my view on the vulnerabilities of our youth and how they are possibly experiencing mental health challenges at this point.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think Dr. D just wants to add on
Yeah,
to that.
I do, because I just think that there's such important, everything is just so incredibly important. So things to highlight, we're talking about losses, and they've been very severe losses of people without the rituals of being no closure or even being able to say goodbye properly. But also just to point out, also, it was mentioned earlier about losses, that we don't often think of the extent of all the losses, because there's the main one, of course, which is to do with family members, friends, and people in our lives. But there's been loss of certainty, there's been loss of predictability, there's been loss of physical contact so much. There's been loss of, as has been highlighted, the usual routine. And most particularly, in the beginning, people thought, all right, we'll cope with it because it's kind of like, what was it, 3 weeks in the beginning, a 3 week sprint, which has now turned into like a 2 year marathon. And we still don't have the absolute horizon in sight. So that lack of certainty is really playing havoc. And what's happened, as I think has already been highlighted, we've some of these, the depression, the anxiety, the lack of certainty has caused all of these kind of mental health problems. But as much as that, it's how we think about the mental. You see, we come down on ourselves because we're not coping. And we come down on ourselves because how come everyone else seems stronger than me? Why am I feeling this? And so, it's our judgment about how we're feeling, about inadequacy. It's the fact that we armor up, and that kind of shame adds another layer to it. So we're not able, Lizzie, what made me think of it is that you were talking about vulnerability. Everybody, in a way, has to be a mental health worker now. We can't only rely on the professional mental health workers. We want to really encourage people to be able, if you name it, you can tame it. If you feel it, you can begin to heal it. But if you say that I'm going through this, I shouldn't be, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy of love and belonging, I don't cope well, you're just putting a lid on it over and over again, which then tends to manifest in behaviors and symptoms and not able to cope. If we can talk about the post-traumatic stress that was alluded to earlier, that we're going to see symptoms, and say, is there any kind of way of minimizing that and and offering and promoting post-traumatic growth? May a little bit of it if we speak about couples, it's been an incubator. There's been a huge rise in breakup and the divorce rate and gender violence, as we know, very much so because of lack of outlet and all of that. But I've also spoken to people to say, my goodness, gave us a chance to sort out things. We dealt with issues that we have never had sat down and dealt with before. I know what my partner's greatest anxiety is, what he, what some of the things that he just hopes for the future. We've never had those kind of conversations before. And so it just kind of has acted as an incubator that if there were mental health problems like Lizzie referred to, they've been exacerbated. If there was an opportunity, a kind of closeness and connection before, there's also been an opportunity for a priority shift to say these are some of the things that I've recognized are quite important in my life. And I've never given. You talk about young people. I've got to tell you, because I was speaking to a CEO the other day, actually in a group, and he said, before the pandemic, I just thought that there were a few short people in my house. I never even knew my kids before. They were just. This has given me an opportunity. Not that we're wanting that opportunity, and the bad effects are much greater than the good effects, but just a realization of what could be important.
Yeah. And I think both you, Dr. D and Lizzie, actually touch on so many important issues. And I think one that is really highlighted is the fact of awareness, right? I think you spoke initially when we introduced the topic of the fact that this mental health has been destigmatized and people are talking about it. And I think Lizzie also touched on the fact that there's also a disparity, right, between the haves and the have-nots, because the haves are becoming more aware and actually doing something about it, where the have-nots are still just experiencing this anxiety, this fear, and this stigmatization, if I can put it in inverted commas, to actually say, why is this happening to me and why am I feeling this? And I suppose then it just leads to the next question for Mr. Mgomezulu. What are some of the warning signs of mental illness, and what treatment options are actually available to people?
The warning signs could be many, because you just have to look at what are the patterns of behaviors. For example, there are a lot of things that can change in an individual, like the way you know yourself, for example. How has your sleep been in the last 3 weeks? Has there been ever changes in terms of your sleeping patterns? There might also be indicators in terms of how you eat, for example. Are you eating too much? Is there a lack of appetite, for example? There might also be changes in terms of your body, where you might be experiencing issues like more of headaches, the body aches, that you cannot actually find a source in terms of where they are coming from. There might also be issues that have got to do with your attention span, your concentration, for example. Issues of being irritable, being oversensitive. When people have known you all these years to be a patient person, you now becoming impatient. Issues of how you have been attending to problems, for example, whether you are becoming more abrupt in terms of taking your decisions, how you interact with people, how do you handle the anger issues, for example. So you're looking at basically what are the changes, that are happening all around you. And I think the very important thing that you have touched on has got to do with what you referred to as the glaring disparities that are there. I really would like to agree to some extent with Dr. D when she says there has been destigmatization of mental health. But when you look at it, yes, it might be happening to people that have got access and they know, and obviously they talk about it. But with people who do not have access, to mental health, is still being viewed differently. I think work still needs to be done in terms of creating awareness, and it's so difficult in most cases because people who are suffering from all of these changes and the symptoms that are more related to depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. Most of the time, they really do not know how to talk about them or express them. And in most cases, if they were to do that, you'll find that most people would think that there's something wrong with them. And I think that is what we need to change, mostly as South Africans, having discussions and being aware that people are being impacted by a number of things in their lives. But that question also, it becomes difficult in a sense that if you, for example, look at our context as South Africans, you look at the access issue to mental health and the shortage of staff that is available. For example, we've got about less than 580 psychiatrists in the whole country, servicing a population that is over like 60 million. And you look at those issues, and you think that how are we going to ever be in a position to address all of these issues? Psychologists that are registered, for example, there are less than 8,000 registered and practicing psychologists. You look at those numbers and you sense that the way that we have been doing things, it needs to change dramatically, because you're looking at a system whereby if there is a mental health issue, that person has to be referred to hospital. And I think that has to change in a way, because if we are to manage the enormity of the problem, we need now to mostly channel the services more on communities, having a community-based approach, basically, where there's access, where if you were to go to a clinic, for example, you would have access to mental service, to mental health services. And that would sort of assist, the way we look at, mental issues, and also addressing, those issues that are in the community. And that would also address issues of visibility and normalizing what is considered to be, mental health issues. So there's a lot that needs to be done. And if really we're looking at the disparities, take, for example, if you look at Europe, for example, you'll find that they are having a lot of psychiatrists, which is, in the region of about 86,000 psychiatrists and 280 psychiatric nurses, for example, and they are servicing a population of about 840 million. And look at our African region, for example, we are having fewer psychiatrists. All in all, roughly there are about 1,200 psychiatrists that have to attend to a population of about 620 million. Looking at those disparities, it simply means that we cannot look at issues of mental health services the same way as Europe has been doing, because they are having the numbers. We have to look at it differently, where if we are to normalize the situation, we have to look at how do we do it in our communities, for example. So if we go out, addressing problems of poverty, and with those programs, we also need to look at how are we going to ensure that mental health issues are also addressed with those programs of poverty alleviation.
So, Lizzie, I'm
Thank
sure
you
you're
so
going to
much.
want to say something. I just want to say that I think that that's the actual major problem that you have highlighted. And that's why I say that we all need to learn that we can't only rely on the mental health professional workers. We need to be more accepting in the community. We need to be less blaming, less
Yes.
judgmental. We
Mm,
need to need to be kinder to ourselves. We need
Yes.
to be able to form tribes, even a tribe of one or two, to be able to say, can you listen to me? Without being an echo chamber, not saying, yes, well, I've got this and I've got that. Do we know how to connect
mm,
and listen to each other? Because all of the shoving under the carpet and the shame and the blame and the lack of exposure is just making it worse. And I think these kind of panels and what you're saying about education is absolutely essential, because we're not suddenly going to have a huge number of new professionals. We have to be able
Yes.
to take on some of it ourselves.
Mm.
And I think this, yeah, it touches on a lot of things. And it was a question I was actually going to pose to you, Dr. D, because you actually said we all need to be psychiatrists to actually say, how can organization support their teams, during this period? And how do we, deal with the fact that the teams now mental well-being is strained from working from home? I mean, they've got personal responsibilities that are clearing and they're there. I mean, I made an example of being a teacher when you're not a teacher, while actually still having to do your work. So what support can actually organization give to their employees, just in the period of adjusting to this new norm that we're
Look,
currently
it's a
experiencing?
really essential question, and I don't mean to say that everybody can be a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I mean, we're talking about years and years and years of training and experience and practice, some medical interventions coming into it as well. What I'm talking about is, well, we started talking about destigmatizing and saying, and we're not all going through, in the same boat. Everyone said we're in the same boat. Obviously, we're not.
Mm.
There's many different boats in the country. Some are in ocean liners and some are in broken rafts. We may
Mm.
be in the same storm, but we're definitely not in the same boat. But when it comes to the workplace, I'm sure that my colleagues have experienced this as well. I'm having conversations and getting requests from the workplace, challenging kind of really. They're saying, you talk about the healing power of support. We want to make support a verb. How do you do support in companies? Not just talk about it. How do we create an internal morale and a support system within our companies? And companies are seeing that some of the shifts that they have to make to be what Brené Brown, our colleague, calls a daring culture, you know, um, um, more than an armored culture. That's what she closed culture. We seeing have benefits anyway, but particularly doing now. So, for instance, can you create structures in the company where people can meet on a regular basis in an atmosphere of confidentiality, perhaps, to talk about some of the challenges that they're going through and see that they're not alone? The minute certain people become vulnerable, vulnerability and openness can be more contagious than the virus. When you look at someone who you admire and you think is a high level person or whatever, and they say to you, I also don't cope and I'm feeling low and uncertain and scared at night or whatever, that gives you permission to do it too. And people in organizations who are creating those structures are seeing that they're able to offer each other just a little slice of themselves, what helps, what they've been through, most especially a feeling that they're not alone. And they're changing certain parameters in the organization. Like, we don't have to be perfect. We don't want a culture of perfection. We want you to be able to be inclusive and say, and be more honest. I don't know how to do that. I do make mistakes sometimes. And most especially, we used to always think, and I think to a large extent we still do, that asking for help means giving up. We're supposed to go it alone. Well, that's absolute nonsense. Actually, asking for help is not giving up. Asking for help is said in saying that I would like some support, some advice, some shared experiences with you. Some of them might resonate with me. And I'm not giving up and turning inwards and being on my own. And I mean, we spoke about suicide, Lizzie did about suicide. Do you know that the greatest cause of death in adolescence is suicide? How sad is that? And it's because of shame. They can't talk. People aren't recognizing symptoms. They're not. So one place where we can say, we expect you to not be okay. Come and tell us about it. It's okay to not be okay. What are some of the fears, the doubts? Can we offer some support, sometimes even practical support, in terms of reassurance of jobs where people are so nervous that unless they're perfect, they're going to be retrenched, or they're nervous about loss of money or loss of salary. It's important to bring these things out into the open. And companies who are caring companies and supportive companies are recognizing that it's not about training, isn't about content anymore or tasks so much anymore. We know about muscle being strong. We know about the brain being clever. Now it's time to know about the heart in terms of being connecting, and that's what we all need.
Sure, and you touched on a lot of points there, and I think one that resonated with me, or what just stood out, is the culture of authenticity. You know, if you can come out and be vulnerable and actually have a conversation with a person, I think we have created, or we're living in a culture, especially as young professionals, where perfection is glamorized. You know, it's glamorized. The fact that you have to work long hours. It's so glamorized. There's this social media I suppose pressure that is also coming through, you know, as a young adult, to actually say, you know, sebenza, I mean, that's the term that they're coining right now, or, you know, just to display the fact that you're hardworking and actually just not giving your mental health the attention that it needs. And I think, Lizzie, it touches in a question I really just want to ask you, like, what can we do as young professionals to actually be kinder to ourselves? You know, I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to actually rise up in the organizations that we're currently working in. Dr. D also touched on it, the mere fact that we're working from home, we don't want to be seen as lazy if we take breaks. So we're actually working extended hours, you know, to demonstrate the value that we bring to the entity. You know, what are some of the things that we can do, you know, to be kinder to ourselves and actually, you know, give ourselves permission to actually take a break as young people?
You know, there's actually quite a lot that one can actually do. But I think, you know, when things were supposedly normal, whatever that means, we took a lot of things for granted. So, you know, it's the little things really that could make a difference. I mean, if you think about the fact that other people have lost jobs, and obviously there are now financial issues at the moment. It doesn't even take a lot of money just to take a break, you know, from whatever stressor it is that one sits with. Something simple like taking a walk, you know, taking a walk, making that part of your routine, just smelling the air outside, talking to, you know, somebody. You know, it's very important to form a support group, even if you're working from home, but someone that you can trust, or some people that you can trust and share some of the challenges that you sit with, especially within the work context, to actually understand some of the difficulties and challenges that you are facing. But also something that you know, could go a long way is just using your senses, or, you know, when you start feeling that, you know what, I'm stressed, something as simple as lighting up a candle and using a scent that could stimulate you and, or calm you down, for example, like lavender or jasmine, and just try and meditate in silence or whatever it is that would, enable you to calm down. Sometimes it could be that your body just needs you to do something physical. Get out there and decide, okay, I'm going to try and clean out my cupboards a little bit. So something that will focus your attention on that one specific task. Sometimes people will decide, okay, I'm going to go for a run, just get those endorphins flowing. Because, like I said, it doesn't really take a lot, but because we didn't have time, because we were so busy, we overlooked a whole lot of that stuff. Having a simple conversation with your child, asking them about school or tell me more about your friends, because simply put, as young parents, we don't have that time, we don't have that patience because work needs to be done. There's so much to be done. But just allowing yourself that hour in a day, which is part of actually forming a new routine and adjusting to this new way of normal. We actually tend to even sometimes forget to realize that our bodies actually also need proper nutrients. Cook yourself an enjoyable meal once in a while. Sit down with a family, have a conversation with a family, reconnect. Because I think, in terms of realizing that with this time that we've been given, we can look at it and say, oh, it's a pandemic, it's such a horrible time. Of course, it's a horrible time because there's been a lot of loss. But then again, it's also given us time to reconcile, time to, reprioritize our lives. Starting to journal, something that you've been putting off for quite a long time. Journaling also helps you to focus on, that one task and gather your thoughts. And with that comes, you trying to understand, where's this thought coming from and how do I reconcile it with what I'm feeling? And that also helps you to just slow down whatever stressor or whatever emotion that could be overwhelming, to actually break it down and process it appropriately. So there's actually quite a lot. Listening to your favorite sounds or listening to a calming sound. you know Sometimes I think we also overlook the fact that finding someone at work, be it someone from HR, and just finding out, okay, have there been new updates in terms of, policies, in terms of flexibility? This is what I'm sitting with. What are my options? Can you help me? What is available? Because sometimes you don't know what is actually being made available, and we take for granted that everybody's working from home, therefore my company is not doing anything. Some companies could also thrive on, wanting people to just work, 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 work. But then remember, you need to set boundaries as well as an individual. Because if you don't do that, you'll end up just running yourself into a rut and debilitating yourself in the process. So you need to take time out to actually really care for yourself and reprioritize your life in a way that will actually work for you and for the organization as well as for your family, because it's also quite important to realize that this is a good time for you to actually bond with those that you haven't had time to spend, um, with. So use the time wisely. It's difficult, it's not easy, but just a little bit or just one activity at a time, stimulate your senses a little bit. Be one with yourself, give time to actually listen to your body, meditate, pray, speak to your pastor if you can, but always try to be in connection or be in touch with someone. Do not allow the isolation, the physical isolation, to also isolate you, because we have technology. We can keep in touch with other people. It's not the same, but don't allow the circumstances to isolate you. It's very important to have the connections.
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Lizzie. And it's important. I think you touched on it. The fact that you can just stand up and take a walk, just, physically removing yourself from a situation actually helps you mentally. I've tried it many times and I've seen it work. And I think some of the comments that are coming through is like, Thank you, Lizzie, for such great insights, and it's coming through on our chat, and I think a lot of people actually needed this. I think this is the question that I'll pose to both Dr. D and Mr. Mgomezulu in closing. You know, at what point as an individual do I start saying that actually I need external help? I've tried everything. I'm not seeing the improvement in results. What are the trigger points, or at what point do I, as an individual, actually say, you know what, I need a professional help to actually help me navigate? I think I'll start with you, Mr. Mgomezulu, and Dr. D, please weigh in, post his comments.
I think it's the way the question is put is as if there will be that point. In actual fact, the point even starts before the point, where, for example, if you are aware of your thoughts and their changes and how much they have changed, right? And you know how you have been thinking, throughout, and how you have been relaxed about issues. Now, all of a sudden, you realize that there are those changes, and you're beginning even to doubt yourself in terms of how you do things. And you are also receiving feedback from people in terms of the changes that has been happening, about you. And you also realize that in terms of how you used to concentrate is no longer happening the way you have known yourself. And also looking at, has there anything that is important that has changed? For example, if you are to look at your sleeping patterns, for example, have they changed? If, for example, you are watching a movie and all of a sudden you are a person now that becomes teary, when you're looking at, scenes, that are sad, or you find yourself, crying, but you can't really put your finger on what has happened. What are you crying? What are you crying about? When you realize that, your confidence is low, you're looking at, your self-esteem, for example, how it has been. The changes that we're experiencing, for example, would normally tell you that it's time to talk to someone. When you realize, for example, that there are a lot of ruminations where you are excessively worried, for no reason, maybe it's time that you should consult. When you realize that, for example, the your eating habits have changed, maybe it's time that you should go and consult. When you realize that things that you used to love the most, you have no interest in them, that should be an indicator that you should begin to consult. It's very difficult because as these things happen, you are not even aware that there are those changes happening. And I really would like to indicate, and agree with Lizzie where she says that, the thing is about documenting where you have your journal. It helps a lot because you can actually see, what are the changes, in terms of what you're writing. What are the changes that have been happening in terms of how you look at life, your general outlook into life, and how your thoughts have changed over a period of time. Is it now becoming a set story that you're writing about? If that is happening, maybe it's time that you should consult. When you find yourself that you are isolating a lot, you're becoming more withdrawn, for example, maybe it's time that you should seek help. There are so many things. If you are in a place of work, when you find that you're becoming more irritable, with your colleagues, for example, and obviously are being given feedback about your performance, for example, it serves as an indicator that something is going wrong. You need to begin to consult or seek help.
Thank you. I really, that was very comprehensive, and certainly I think that it's been said. I think that we've referred to physical symptoms, lower backache, migraine headache, sleep disturbances, appetite problems, where it gets reflected in your physical health. We refer to psychological symptoms like extreme mood changes, excessive behavioral symptoms, irritability, or feeling very low. And I think it's back again to the story that, there is lack of awareness. Certainly, we're not always sure that this is happening, and it helps to see it in black and white. But if you don't own the story owns you. If you start putting it under the carpet over and over again, these things just metastasize like a cancer, and they get worse and worse and worse. So awareness is incredibly important. Awareness is the first step to change. And there are two factors in this that I think we need to bear in mind. One is duration, the other is extent. How long has this been going on for? Is this just a bad couple of days in reaction to something that has happened? Or is it continuing such that it's affecting my functioning? That's a big, big indicator. And how bad is it? Is it bad not only in terms of continuity, but in the fact that I can see that I'm not able to function in any way like I would before? Big, big markers. How long and how much, even when there's been an initial lack of awareness. And then just to pick up, I want to just say, Lizzie, you reminded me of two things that I hadn't thought about for a very long time. There's just, we say, you've got to find time in the day for yourself. I want to change that around and to say you have to make time, not find the time. We have to cut ourselves some slack. It's not, will I find 15 minutes or an hour in the day? I recognize that I have to look after my partner's partner. I have to look after my child's mother. I have to look after my employee's employer. I've got to look after my colleague's colleague. And sometimes it's easier for us to say that to ourselves than to say, I've got to take care of me. Because we all reared to be responsible and be other people's nurturers and caregivers. But we're going to fall off the rail and be useless to anyone unless we start really prioritizing ourselves. And it's not, as we started off with this whole thing, it's not one day when anymore, one day when I've got more time or whatever. The future has to be now, because we can see that the rug can be pulled under our feet in a heartbeat. If you would have said 2 years ago, or maybe, I don't know, I've even lost track of time, that there's going to be like a plague that's a virus that's going to kind of be a global issue that will kill millions of people. We'd say, what movie have you been watching? It sounds like it's quite a good movie. Or otherwise, what have you been smoking? Because we actually live in the 21st century. Where no one could ever have imagined that. And I think one of the things where you say we prioritize, that people are saying that, we need to take care of ourselves, other people, do the things if we can, and make the most in a different way of life and of love and of every day. That's all that I can say.
I think we actually have overrun. I think an hour is actually not enough to go through this topic. There's just so much surrounding it, it's so close to all of our hearts, and I think it's because it's our daily lived experiences. Just to touch on the fact that just be aware of your patterns, be aware of the changes. So awareness is quite key. I think Dr. D said it: if you can name it, you can contain it. And Lizzie also said it: journalize. There's just so much that we can still discuss, but we have ran over on our hour. I think one of the comments that I've read is just so touching, just in closing, to actually say this is a great conversation, and there's still so much to learn and unlearn where mental health is concerned, particularly for those who play the supportive structure through those suffering from mental health. With that, it's goodbye from me. I'd like to just hand over to Mrs. H, just to wrap up and close, and thank our panelists. I think this was an amazing conversation, and I think just I could ask you 150 questions because you're so engaging and so knowledgeable on the topic. And thank you so much for giving of your time and giving of your knowledge to us and the attendees. Thank you so much, guys. Over to you, Mrs. H.
Thank you so much, Kosi. And again, thank you so much to all the panelists. And I'm going through all the comments and they're phenomenal. We're also posting all the chats in all of our other chat groups that the YLC members and the IWFSA members belong to. And actually Triforsa, who is our chair for the YLC committee, has asked us to please send her this recording because she's in a Harvard class and she still wants to listen to it because of all of the hype that these ladies are creating on the other chat groups, repeating what's been said here. So thank you very much to all of our panelists, and I really appreciate it. I agree with you, Kosi. I don't think that this time is enough, and I think there's so many warning signals and signs that all of the panelists pointed out, and there were one or two that I thought, oh, hey, hang on, I recognize that. Oh, that was me yesterday. Oh, goodness, that was me a few days ago. So thank you very much for that, and I think we look forward, Kosi, to a follow-up conversation of this. I don't think that this is a once-off series. And for everyone who's taken their time out this evening to join us, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone. Thank you very much.